Hey guys, I hope you're all doing good. In the last couple of videos, we took a look at surface preparation. So here we learned about the type of errors that a surface file can have and how some of those errors can be fixed. Though it was not a comprehensive session, you would have still understood, how the errors look like and what is the general strategy that we need to follow to fix it. So in this video, we are going to be learning something called as boundary flagging. So the whole idea is when your geometry is represented as a bunch of triangles, you need to group these triangles into meaningful boundaries. And once you have done them, you can use these boundaries to create volumetric regions, and you can also use these boundaries to specify the required boundary conditions. So I've created a simple shape using a 3D CAD software, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain to you the typical process that a designer follows and how a CFD analyst uses the geometry that a designer has created. So in this case, this is a fairly simple geometry. You can think of this as 3 cylinders in an inline engine and this being the crankcase, or you can also think of this as oil storage containers in an oil power plant. Okay, so once I have modeled my design, what I need to do is I need to save it as a STL file. Alright, so STL is the triangulated file format that CONVERGE accepts. I'm going to go to desktop and I'm just going to call this as alright, and if I click on save, it's going to save the geometry. Alright, so now what we are going to do is we are going to pull this geometry into CONVERGE Studio. I'm going to get started with a new project. So the easiest way to load a STL file is to just open your file explorer, take your geometry and then just drag it. Alright, so here you can see that our geometry appears. If I run the diagnosis, you can see that it does not have any problems because the geometry is fairly simple. So the idea is we have to group these triangles into boundaries. And to do that, let's go to the boundary tab in the geometry doc, go to flag, and I'm just going to add some boundaries. I'm going to be creating multiple boundaries here. I don't know how many boundaries I want to create beforehand, but let me just create a few, okay? So let's start with something very simple, So I'm going to create a boundary that contains these two faces. So make sure that I'm in triangle selection mode. I select these two faces, pick the boundary that I want, and then click apply. So these two triangles now belong to that particular boundary. So now for this two triangles, I can specify unique boundary conditions. All right. So similarly, I can pick these two triangles manually, or I can just use the angle option, right? So the angle option is going to work whenever there's strong feature edges, right? Whenever you have strong features like this, the angle option is going to work very well. All right. Similarly, I can use the angle option to take the top face and then add it to a new boundary and do something like this as well. All right. So for the cylinders, I'm going to be creating a few additional boundaries. And starting boundary 7, let's create maybe 4. I think that should be enough. All right. So this time what I'm going to do is for boundary number 7, I'm just going to use the angle method. I can pick all these 3 faces at the same time and add it to that boundary. And for boundary 8, I'm just going to pick one guy at a time. And the last cylinder goes to boundary number 10. So there is no way to, undo your boundary addition step. Okay, so the best way to go about this is, select your boundary ID 0, which is the default boundary. Just draw a box around your entire geometry. That's going to select everything and just click apply. Now let us look at other ways of flagging boundaries. The method that we're going to explore first is called as boundary fences. If you remember in the last video, we used between two vertices option to select two vertices to create what is called as a boundary fence. And then, if you do the boundary fence, and if you're able to close it, then what happens is you're able to select areas inside the boundary fence and outside the boundary fence. So I can basically select this guy alone, or if I click outside the box, it's going to separate my selection. So now I have two boundaries like this, right? So now to remove a particular fence, what I can do is I can click on by selected edges, select a particular fence and click on unmarked fence, and that's going to remove that fence. And I can do the same step for multiple edges. All right, so you still see that I have one particular fence. But the easier way to clear all the fences is to just go to find/clean and then click on this clean option. All right, so the find/clean menu gives us a lot of good options. So what you can actually do is there is a button called find here. So let's just click that and see what happens. So when you do that, CONVERGE Studio automatically creates boundary fences. It's basically like edge detection. You know, it's looking at the triangles and it's automatically creating these boundary fences based upon this upper bound. All right. Okay, so the idea is we are looking at triangles that meet at an angle in the specified boundaries. So for example, here the angle between, say, this particular triangle and this triangle is 90 degrees. Sorry, I'm in edge selection mode. So let me go to triangle selection mode. So the angle between these two triangles, right, is 90 degrees. And you can see that 90 is probably the maximum degree. And as long as the angle is within 135 degrees, it's going to just loop over all the triangles and it's going to mark this boundary fence for us. So this is a fairly useful technique. So in this particular case, what I can do is, I can go back to flag and I can flag triangles using the boundary fence method. All right, so it's going to be the same as angle method. So it really doesn't matter. It's totally your choice. So usually what I do is when I get a complex geometry, I try the angle method first and then the boundary fence method. All right, so here you can just do the same thing that we did before. Again, I'm not creating the boundaries in any particular order. It is just I'm trying to group it as best as I can. All right, so now let's go back and let's learn how to fine tune the selection a little bit more. All right, so I'm going to go to boundary fence and I'm just going to clean my fence. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide the cylinder into 4 quadrants and I'm going to add each of those quadrants into a particular boundary fence. All right, so what I can do is I can first create some fences and then go to fence and I'm going to click on between 2 vertices and I'm just going to click on this first vertex, make sure that cursor pick selection is on and the center one, click apply. Again, I'm just eyeballing like quarter of a circle, so it's really not accurate, but this exercise actually helps you, pick the vertices correctly, rotate the geometry and manipulate the selection. All right, so you can see that I've created one boundary fence here. So if I go to flag and if I go to boundary fence, I should be able to select this guy and this guy separately, add that as a single boundary. All right. So now would be a good time to talk about rotational transformations. So in the process of creating the fence, let us say that I'm trying to select this particular vertex. Now when I try to rotate the geometry around the vertex, you can see that it's very hard for me to rotate about that particular point, and it clearly seems like there is a center of rotation, and you know what there is. So when you click on a particular object, you can right click, and what you can do is you can click on view at, and that is going to change that point as your center of rotation, which means now you can rotate about that point. This is extremely useful when you're working really close to the geometry, and I can kind of demonstrate that. So now let us say that this is my rotation center, okay, and you're zooming, you're still zoomed in and you want to rotate about this particular point. So I'm selecting this point, and if I try to rotate, you can see that it's becoming very hard, and especially if I zoomed in, even for slight motion of my mouse, the geometry moves around a lot and that becomes very hard to control. So I can right click and click on view at, or alternatively I can use the shortcut Control E, and now rotating about this point becomes really easy. All right, so that's a handy shortcut. Okay, I apologize for taking the deviation, but I thought that's a tool that you need to know. So let's continue here. So I'm going to create an additional fence, something like this. All right, you can see that here it's not straight, so I'm going to select that particular edge, make sure that by selected edge option is selected, and then I'm just going to click on unmarked fence. And this time I'm just going to use this edge because I know that that's what I want. I can click on mark fence. So now instead of selecting vertices, what I can do is I can just select this particular edge and this particular edge. Again, I'm just eyeballing it. There's no exact way to do it. Just pick a target and try to see if you can achieve it. All right, so now if I go back to fence, use the boundary fence method, select the next boundary, all right. So the nice thing about creating boundaries is sometimes when the geometry becomes complex, you don't know what's inside. So when I've created a few boundaries, what I can do is I can just select any triangle and automatically the right boundary gets selected. So for example, if I select here, you can see that boundary 1 is highlighted. If I select here, boundary 4 is highlighted. So what I can do is I can just click on the boundary and then hit V, V as in view, and that's going to hide that particular boundary. And if I press it again, it's going to toggle it, right? So that's a very handy feature because now I can rotate the geometry, press V, and then see what's inside. All right. Similarly, if I flag this as a separate boundary, you can see that I can take a look at what's going on. All right. So I hope that helps you understand what boundary flagging is and how you can use the angle method and the boundary fence method to group the triangles. So now let's work on a different geometry. I've created one more geometry, which is this duct. So let us first export this duct as a STL file. There we go. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to diagnosis, make sure that the geometry does not have any problems. And I'm just going to rotate to see how the shape looks like. So let us try to do this, right? You obviously have two shapes here that are intersecting with each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create like a few boundaries. Let me just add a few of them. And I'm going to get started with the easiest ones. By this time, you know that you can select these boundaries using the angle method. So let's call this as the first boundary. Let's call this guy as the second boundary. And this one can be your third boundary. Now these boundaries can be inlets or outlets, anything that you want. With respect to boundary conditions, we'll be having a separate lecture to talk about those. But for now, we are just grouping the triangles, all right? So now if I use my angle method and if I try to select this, this is not really working out. So since it's not working, what I'm going to do is I'm going to see if I can play with this angle parameter a little bit, maybe reduce it to 10 degrees and see if I can select it. All right, so that also doesn't seem to work. And maybe you can change it to even more smaller numbers. Okay, so now you can see that it is starting to select, but the selection is now narrowed down too much. So maybe let's increase this a little bit. All right, you can see that now, depending on where you click, it seems to be very sensitive. I think I found a particular point where it just selected a particular strip, but now I'm not able to produce it again. There we go, right? So I can kind of do this, but this is not going anywhere, all right? So what can I do? Well, this is where manual intervention is required. Sometimes the inbuilt methods do not work, and this is where we rely upon our intelligence to figure out where we want to divide this particular duct. And if you think about it, when I'm looking at it, or if you're looking at it, the obvious choice seems to be this particular line. But why is Studio not able to pick it up? Well, there's a reason for that. If I'm displaying the normals, if the normals look too big for you, zoom in and then retoggle them. So that way the normals would appear in a decent size. The problem that's occurring here is the normals, there's a smooth distribution and the direction of the normals do not change a lot. And because of that, the angle method has a very hard time trying to figure out where the edge is. right? So on the other hand, we can basically see that there is a characteristic edge here, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a simple boundary fence. So let's go to fence, and even before going to fence, let's go to find clean and then try to click on the find method. That's going to do it automatically. And when you do that, you can see that it was able to draw a fence on one side of it. So that's good, right? We can use that, and we can construct the remaining fence manually. So let me go back to fence, and I'm going to use the vertex method. So the nice thing about the vertex method is you can select a starting point and an ending point, and you can expect it to draw a fence continuously. Sometimes it fails, but sometimes it works. So let's maybe start with this particular point. All right, so our aim is that there's going to be a fence that's going to get created from here to here. Usually it relies upon the shortest path, so sometimes it can get screwed up. So let me click on mark fence, and there you go. It seemed to work correctly. So now the next fence that I want to create is going to start at this point. And let's try to maybe rotate the geometry, and I'm being a bit ambitious here. I'm saying, okay, try to create a fence from here to here. Now obviously, right, it's basically like telling CONVERGE, okay, you're at this point, go to that point, and we're expecting that it's going to take this particular path. All right, so let's click on mark fence, right? You see that it did do that, but it went in the other direction. So what you might have to do is you might have to help out CONVERGE a little bit by selecting this particular point and maybe a point somewhere here. So this way, the shortest way to go from this point to this point is by going right and not going all the way around the pipe. So if I do mark fence now, I can be quite sure that this is going to work. And for this rest of the path, I can just with confidence select my starting points and ending points. Clicking on mark fence again, there we go. So now you can see that we have actually divided this duct into 3 pieces. So let's go back to boundary fence and maybe add one more boundary. And this time use the boundary fence method. Let's click on this guy. This guy. Now you can see that when I'm trying to click here, I'm not getting the duct as a single boundary. Why is that? That means that my boundary fence is leaking somewhere. So you can see that from here to here, the boundary fence is quite neat, but then there is a huge opening here, right? So which means when I click on a triangle here, the selection is just going to get leaked over to the other side. So I need to just close my boundary fence. So go back, maybe click on this point. You always need to zoom in, make sure that you select the right point, zoom out, and click on this particular point. Okay, so I'm going to just click on mark fence right now. That looks neat. Go back to boundary fence and try selecting one side of the duct. This time it worked. And we can select the other boundary and add the other side of the geometry. All right, so I hope with these 2 exercises you are able to understand boundary fencing very well, and you're also able to use it. These geometries are also available to you. Download the geometry and then practice along with the video, and feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions. All right, thank you guys, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.